Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Front Page, the Racing Post show which seeks to shed light on the most important stories in racing. I'm Racing Post editor Tom Kerr and I'm deputising this week for regular host Lee Mottershead, who won't appreciate me telling you it's his birthday. I'm very pleased to be joined by two of the brightest and best at the Racing Post, Maddy, Playle and John Harding.
Morning, Tom.
Morning, guys. Those of you who have seen the show before will know how it works. Each of us will nominate a story which we think was the most important from the previous week. We'll discuss why we made that choice, what we think was significant about the story, and try to understand what might happen next. At the end of this, in a process which is neither fair nor transparent, I'll determine what goes on the front page. It's been a dramatic week in the world of racing. We've had further fallout from the Tory-Gosden split. We've had more interference issues, and we've had Sir Mark Prescott on the road to the Arc. But Maddy, we're going to come to you first. Which story do you think should go on the front page this week?
Yes, I'm going to be talking about a story that's been in many of our pages in the newspaper, which is about the plunging crowds. They're down about a third in May. Peter Scargill, I think, had the initial story with this. It was followed up with David Carr. And indeed today, Lee Mottershead's Monday column touches upon it. Matt Rennie's story this morning spoke of attendance figures at Sundown being down. The attendance of 9,500 was more than 4,000 down on the last eclipse, which was before the pandemic. So a drop of nearly 31%. Now, you referenced this morning Wimbledon, which obviously we don't have the final statistics, that sort of event is down 11%. So when we're comparing racing to other sports, that's still a very, very big drop. So the average attendance at tracks in May was 2,951 compared to 4,179 for the same month in 2019. Obviously, that was the most recent year in which there weren't any coronavirus restrictions. And if you use the BHA figures back to 1995, it's the first time average attendances at British courses in May have fallen below 3,000. Barring, again, those pandemic-affected years. Total of 153 fixtures took place in May 2019, with 639,430 people going racing, compared to 445,689 attending the 151 fixtures for this year. So this is a huge drop we're talking about. Why is it happening? Well, among people to reference the cost of living crisis was the Racecourse Association's David Armstrong, and obviously we're seeing that impacted people up and down the UK. Also, Chief Executive Officer of Great British Racing, Rod Street, agreed, and he spoke about how people are now prioritising what they spend their money on. Now we're emerging from this coronavirus pandemic, and he said that other sports are struggling too, which they are, but of course it's all at different extents. We've rolled out a new piece in our newspaper called the Racecourse Price Index, where we take apart the cost of going racing. That's another thing that's been referenced. And then falling field sizes, which is another story that we've done lots of work on and seeing significant trends there, and also racegoer experience. So there are lots of different strands to why this could be. What can be done about it? Well, first off, we talk about tackling the problem at its core. When you look at field sizes, we need to address that, whether that's through prize money or making sort of fundamental changes. But also lowering prices. We're seeing racecourses like Catterick and Redcar, they are operating now with reduced prices. Indeed, York, for their July 8th meeting, have offered concessions, which is a story that Chris Cook was speaking about on this show last week, particularly for our older sort of customers in racing. And I also want to touch upon a column that David Jennings wrote a couple of weeks ago about racegoer experience, and actually when you go racing, how enjoyable and how much you get out of it compared to just watching on TV, which is I think something that we really need to focus on in our sport at the minute, because TV coverage is so strong, you get such insight. I really don't think what we get as a racecourse customer is necessarily as good as it could be. So from my perspective, that's something that I think there is achievable goals. I think that's something that we could quite easily improve, not necessarily costing the earth, but of course that helps. But yeah, this is a huge story that's gonna go on and on. And of course, if you don't have customers, then you don't have a sport. So it's very, very important.
Yeah. So this is a massive story. There's loads to unpack here. Let's just think, first of all, the context of this and the significance of it is quite direct. It means racing has fewer fans coming through the gates and less money to spend on everything that needs funded.
Absolutely right. It's a huge knock-on effect, and my take on it has always been you're always going to have headwinds like cost of living crisis. The competition for that leisure pound, as we've seen with Wimbledon, as we've seen with racing, is only going to become more fierce as people have to make harder decisions about how they spend their disposable income. But that is a challenge to be risen to rather than shied away from. And for me, the product does not remotely tally with the price.
Well, this is something that we need to pick up here, because if you read our story last week, the sort of leaders in racing were very clear. This is down to the cost of living crisis, and we all know that this is having a huge effect on consumers up and down the country. But do we think that is an accurate summary of the situation? Is it cost of living, or is it the product?
Yeah, I think the cost of living crisis is true, and yes, of course it has an impact, but at the same time, racing's probably been sleepwalking into this a little bit in the last couple of years, and we really need to use this as motivation to actually think, well, even if there wasn't a cost of living crisis and we weren't having to compete to the same degree for that money, we need to do more and we need to do better.
Yeah, I think it's a factor, but not necessarily an excuse. It's very easy to point outwards and say, well, you know, we've got all these factors and it's out of our control. And yes, as I said, that it is putting more pressure on people's pockets. That is going to have a knock-on effect for people attending events such as racing, Wimbledon, whatever it might be. But at the same time, there needs to be a little bit of introspection and looking at, well, in this competitive marketplace, it's only going to become more competitive because of the financial headwinds. Are we doing everything we can to maximise, I'm loath to call it a product, but maximise the product? And I would argue, no, we're not. Poor field
We're talking about this as well. We've had Great British Racing's recent marketing campaign rolled out that was, cost an awful lot of money as well. So
1.6 million, I think it was, yeah.
Exactly. So we're talking about, we should be doing more, and we can do more to attract customers for sure.
One of my concerns is that you see this across every big issue affecting this sport, whether you're talking about the racing calendar, whether you're talking about field sizes, there just seems a complete lack of urgency, or indeed even a plan from racing's leaders. And we all know that the way racing is organised is basically a recipe for paralysis. It's the most ineffectual, dysfunctional governance structure imaginable. But nonetheless, you would at least want someone in a leadership position standing up and saying, we know things aren't going right, we know things have to change, these are the things that need to change, and this is what we want to do. And basically lay down the challenge to the rest of racing, get behind me, or tell me what your plan is. But right now, it just sort of seems there isn't a plan. Field sizes, a great example. No doubt people going racing and getting a series of 500-600 races are not getting a great deal. But what proposals are there on the table to deal with field sizes? Well, we do know for certain that the only thing on the table for next year was dropped, and therefore we're looking at 2024 before anything major with the racing calendar might happen. By 2024, it's too late, isn't it?
Yeah.
They just need to do something quicker, don't they?
And it's a momentum thing. If you wait too long and it begins to snowball and snowball and snowball, where you're getting to a point where you are having to almost beg people to come racing, we don't want to be in that position. We're not in it yet. But as you say, it's quite a disparate approach. You've got racecourses doing their own little things. York's always been, I've always held York up as a fairly good example of a racecourse run right. And the concessions are a great idea, but it needs to be an industry level approach. It can't be this racecourse going off its own back. And I just think there needs to be some sort of long term, this is how we fix it.
I saw a great tweet this morning. I'm going to give James Knight from Correlate a shout out here. Great tweet. He said, we need some change in racing, but I'm not going to be bothered asking for it, because I know the only thing that will actually mean significant change happens is another pandemic. And it's weird to hark back to the sort of 2020 with any enthusiasm whatsoever. But at least racing's leaders came together, agreed a plan involving rapid changes, and it had positive impact. So, surely that's what should happen right now. crisis conference, get all the racing leaders in a room, basically say to them, you're not leaving until you come up with an agreement, a plan for how racing is going to deal with field sizes, attendances, and the other problems affecting the sport right now. Okay guys, my story from last week is actually two stories about gambling review and affordability checks. Now we had two stories on this. First of all, early last week, we heard from industry sources and reports elsewhere in the media that the gambling review, the long-awaited review of gambling law in this country, is finally going to be published. What we think will come from that is that some of the proposals that have been talked about over the last couple of years, potentially affecting racing and punters, will not be as strong as they might have been. And the most famous of these, the most infamous of these, is affordability checks. These are the idea that anyone wanting to bet over a certain level would have to sort of justify that they could afford it to the bookmaker by submitting financial documentations, pay slips, and so forth. So we heard that those would only be introduced in non-intrusive fashion. That's sort of soft checks that bookmakers can carry out without actually demanding that you submit your documentation. So this is a good news story for racing, good news story for punters. For punters, because they don't need to go through something really invasive and time-consuming in order just to have a bet. And good for racing, because anything that stops punters or deters punters from betting means another hit to the finances. So that was quite good news, and we're hoping to see this white paper this week, although let's not hold our breath. The next day, though, we had a follow-up story, a big splash. Bill Barb has been working on this story for several weeks now, basically revealing the degree to which affordability checks, which, as we heard, are only going to be introduced in non-intrusive fashion, have already been introduced in intrusive fashion by the Gambling Commission, which regulates betting in Britain. Now, basically, what the Gambling Commission have done here is that they've sort of said, we have a responsibility to protect the vulnerable, and they've sort of interpreted that in the most sweeping way possible and said to bookmakers, if you're not doing affordability checks for punters who are staking even, fairly modest amounts of money, then you are not protecting your customers. So the bookmakers obviously have introduced checks. Now, why this is really significant, not only because they've done this, it's having an effect on racing already, it's having an effect on punters already, is because we spoke to MPs and legal experts who said the Gambling Commission are well outside their remit. They don't have a mandate to introduce checks like this. Now, I think this is really significant for a few reasons. First of all, there's the effect it has on ordinary punters. If you are wanting to have a bet and then suddenly your bookmaker hits you with a request for your last 3 months' pay slips, well, I don't know about you, but I'm not going to bet with that bookmaker anymore. Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive faff. It's an invasion of your privacy. So it's a really, really sort of, a frustrating experience for any punters. It's a problem for racing because racing derives a huge chunk of its income from media rights deals and the levy, north of 200 million a year. And racing's leaders had estimated that affordability checks could cost, half of that, potentially. So a huge, huge chunk of racing's funding, and with all the calamitous knock-on effects that would have. But then the thing which I just think is so important here is that a regulator, a completely unaccountable regulator, unelected regulator, has gone ahead and introduced these hugely controversial checks, even though they knew at the same time the government, which whatever you might think about it, is at least elected, is debating these very things. And I think if you're going to introduce something which is completely unprecedented, checks to spend your own money, then that's something that should at least be debated by Parliament. I don't know, this is the story which really sort of animates me, really sort of, gets me going from a sort of civil liberties point of view. Maddy, do you have any sympathy with what the Gambling Commission have done, or do you think they've just massively gone over the top without waiting for Parliament to have a say?
Look, I think we will all probably agree on this front that we need to be trying to look after problem gamblers, identify them, and where appropriate, offer support. But what they've done, as you say, is leapfrog these key discussions, and hopefully this white paper that we'll see this week, in making this move and implementing them, prematurely, I think, if to that strong degree that we're talking about. I'm with you. I mean, I think it's invasive. I think in many cases it's probably unnecessary. And we have to make sure that when these affordability checks, if they're going to happen, that they're happening with research, with reason behind them, rather than just a blanket rollout of sort of punishing ordinary casual punters who have a very healthy relationship with the sport.
Yeah, I mean, I just find it extraordinary. One of the numbers that was bandied about, and I think it's safe to say it's not going to be anything like this, was £100 a month. You can go out to a restaurant in London and have a dinner for two, even quite a modest place, and spend £100. That's just the reality of things these days. Yeah. So the idea that £100 is a level at which the government should be mandating a spending check is just bizarre. But John, the gambling review, nonetheless, I think we all agree it is necessary, it is important. It's updating a law which dates back to 2005, well before the sort of digital betting revolution really hit its stride. There's some other surprising things in there from the reports last week. Sounds like even things which people thought were quite uncontroversial, such as a ban on shirt sponsorship in the Premier League, might be dropped. Quite a surprising sort of list of proposals that we're seeing.
It is, absolutely, and we've spent many months and months, and racing has spent many months guessing and trying to get a steer on what this was going to look like, and naturally you go to sort of disaster planning and thinking about affordability checks that are hugely intrusive. So there'll be sort of a few brows being wiped after that, because generally speaking it feels like quite a soft, measured approach, and I was quite heartening to see they're making fair distinctions between casino and sports betting as well. Yeah. Which is very important from a racing perspective.
We're going to have sort of restrictions on stakes for online slots and casino games, aren't they? Sort of bringing it into line with what they've done with FOBTs. And there's some rational explanation for that. These are games which we do know can be sort of more addictive, and therefore it makes sense for them to bring them into line with what they've done in the high street. One of the interesting things I thought we read last week was that the new BHA chairman said that they're already feeling the impact of affordability checks. They're seeing decreased returns in the media rights payments, in levy payments, since they've started to really kick in this year. And that to me is illustrative of how potentially damaging these are, because what we're seeing right now is that if you get hit by an affordability check at one bookmaker, you just go to another, and I'm sure we've all done it, whether it's affordability or KYC or whatever, the request for documentation comes in and you're like, see you later, guys. I'll bet with someone else.
I've certainly done it.
Exactly. Yeah. But that's because right now we have this incredibly free market in this country. You can bet with, dozens of bookmakers, and it's not much of a problem if one of them closes its door to you or makes it very difficult to have a bet, because you simply go elsewhere. But affordability checks, if they were introduced, and as they are being introduced by the Gambling Commission, will potentially end that situation, because we're also going to get something called the single customer view, which basically means that every bookmaker has access to your sort of betting, not in a way that they can actually scrutinise it, but so they know how much you're spending across the sort of industry as a whole, which means that if one place hit you up for affordability checks, you would not be able to bet anymore. And that's really the sort of nuclear moment, because that's when people just drop out of it entirely.
Yeah, and that will obviously encourage people to gamble on the black market, which in itself is going to open up a whole can of worms. When there's unregulated gambling, it's almost counterintuitive. So we have to ask that this is also going to bring about changing people's betting habits, and what these changes are actually going to do.
And I guess the last thing that has to be said on this is, even though it sounds like the Gambling Review white paper will be a lot less stringent than we feared, because the Gambling Commission are already implementing these affordability checks, there remains a question mark over what happens if the government recommends affordability checks should only be introduced in non-intrusive fashion. The Gambling Commission is likely to be given more powers as part of this process, but can the Gambling Commission actually be trusted with those powers, given that they've already shown that they interpret their responsibility to protect vulnerable people as we must impose these checks on basically everyone, and that they've also not waited for government in the first place. So it's a real question mark over what will the Gambling Commission do. And I have to say, if it does have an impact on racing's finances, we've got poor attendances costing the sport money.
Yep.
We've got poor field sizes costing the sport money and lost betting revenues and lost attendances, and potentially affordability checks. This is a potential perfect storm at a time when racing can least afford this sort of damage. Okay, so our final story, something with you, John, is a little bit unusual because it's not actually a story which is featured in the Racing Post this week. In fact, it's a story which is only featured in the Racing Post a few times over the last 4 months, but elsewhere, throughout the world, it's fair to say, the most important story of 2022. So, John, last week you took a pretty unusual trip. Do you want to tell us about it?
I certainly did, yeah. So I joined Gay Kellaway, who's been raising donations, and a team of volunteers, mostly racing people, to take supplies to the Poland-Ukraine border to an equine rescue centre near Rzeszów, which is called the Lesnowola Equine Centre. And it's run by a remarkable lady called Charlie Thornycroft, who went out there on a fact-finding mission for the British Equestrian Federation to see what she could do to help the horses. And that was at the beginning of March, and she's been back only twice since then, working without a salary to help animals, get them across the border in the first instance. But her role has since evolved enormously, and she's become quite literally the point of contact in eastern Poland for getting supplies into Ukraine, into refugee centres and around the area. So we took out supplies, mostly animal, but also some humanitarian stuff as well, things like first aid kits, because sadly children can't go to school in some areas unless they have a first aid kit with them, which is, you just couldn't imagine in a Western civilization in 2022, but there we go. So we went there and did a few drops. It was a grueling journey. We took 3 vehicles, 8 of us, roughly 15 hours, a bit longer in a lorry, which is... monotony is the main issue with that, unfortunately. But we got there, we survived, and had the bigger picture in mind. So we dropped off supplies at a former gym, which a Polish boxer had turned into a refugee centre, which was amazing. Delivering electric fencing so we could keep horses over in Ukraine rather than have the logistical nightmare of getting them over to Poland. We then went to Przemyśl, which is very close to the border, and that was a refugee centre, which was fairly harrowing experience, to tell you the truth. And then up to Maddy, which is right on the border, to meet a group of very remarkable people who went out to fight and ended up delivering supplies quite deep into Ukraine, using chocolate to bribe their way through checkpoints. And of course that comes with some harrowing stories, and it's been an enormous eye-opener because there's a lot of evil, horrible people in the world, but I also witnessed a great deal of compassion, both from the volunteers and the people out there. Like I said, there's a lovely line from Charlie sort of saying that I'll help anything with a pulse. And that's exactly what she's done. She's rescued up north of 400 horses, north of 200 people, hedgehogs, tortoises, cats, dogs. If she can help, she will. And she's just a remarkable lady. And we were able, through a charity called Love Bristol, rather than coming back with empty horse boxes and things like that, we brought 4 Ukrainians back, a Ukrainian couple and a grandmother and a granddaughter who were living with host families in Poland.
It's wonderful. I think it's been so long, we're so inured to the sort of realities of war in this continent that we forget what it's like to have the sheer scale, millions of people pouring over borders seeking safety. But it's not just people as well. The entire world that they inhabit, comes with them or needs to be or hopefully can be saved as well. And that means their horses, their pets, their belongings, the things that make a life a life. John, it sounds an absolutely harrowing trip, but also an inspiring one. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the people you met and maybe just one or two of their stories?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I say, it was harrowing, but the empathy I witnessed from people over there and from volunteers was just something to behold, really, and it was inspiring. That's the one way of putting it. Firstly, Charlie, she was planning for the Platinum Jubilee, working in events, and dropped everything, and is now living at an equestrian centre in eastern Poland, sleeps 3 days a week, and is just superwoman, really. Wow. That's the only way of describing it, just a remarkable lady. And among our volunteers, it was quite an eclectic mix of, we had a lovely guy called Aidan, who was the only non-racing person. He was bored of Zoom meetings in his living room and thought he could help. We had a lovely guy called David Dormer, who's in his 60s. He had fought cancer and is an ongoing thing with cancer, and he had a nice story in that he felt very useless at home, but he really stepped up and wanted to make a difference and wanted to do something. He didn't want to just sit down and watch it happen on the news, and he was brilliant with the Ukrainian couple in particular that we brought back. He would wait with them. When we did a final drop on the last morning, he stayed at the hotel because he didn't want them to wake up and us be gone, because it's such an enormous leap of faith. They don't speak the language, and they're essentially getting in a car with a bunch of strangers that they've been told is going to Britain, but they don't know. And then their lives are in suitcases. So it's very vulnerable, traumatised people. But with David and with the other volunteers, empathy comes so naturally. They didn't have to think once. It's just their natural response is to help out their fellow humans and animals as well. Just an enormous amount of, I think racing, I can be very proud of the way these people have raised donations, and Gay Kellaway's been a big part of that, but also just stepped up and gone so far beyond the line of duty.
We often see that, don't we? In times of crisis, people in racing and the community sort of pull together, and I mean, let's be honest, there's no bigger crisis than this to do that. And as you say, it's very touching. I'm looking forward to reading the fallout from everything you've done, and I think it's just it's incredible, really, how people have pulled together to try and help people and animals, and it's a story that clearly we need to be talking about.
I agree, and it is a great testament to racing that, whenever there is a crisis like this, the sport does step up. It looks after its own exceptionally well, but also, it's also filled with warm-hearted and practical people.
Yeah, that's the big
being
thing.
the crucial thing. As journalists, I fear, we're good at telling stories, but unfortunately probably slightly less on the practical side. Notwithstanding your epic trip across Europe, John, very well done for doing that. It sounds like an incredible story, and of course you'll be writing about it this week. Sunday's paper, I think it will be in.
Sunday's paper.
And online for members on the Saturday evening. We should say you can still donate. They're still raising funds.
Yes.
And if anyone would like to donate, we will put the link in the video description. Okay, so it falls to me to make a difficult decision. I think it's a front page story. John, your story is absolutely enormous. It is the biggest story in the world right now. Is it the front page of the Racing Post? Perhaps not. I didn't say it was fair or transparent, didn't I? So attendances or the gambling review. Attendances are absolutely huge because it's directly impacting racing's public appeal and its income currently. But I think we would agree that this is a ship that can be rated and hopefully will. So you'll be unsurprised to hear I'm going to go for my story.
Here we go. Here we go.
This is a familiar feeling. I'm going to go for my story because the gambling review and affordability checks, if we don't get them right, this is it for a generation. These are gambling laws. It's going to affect everyone. It's going to affect the sport. We need to get this right. Government needs to get this right. It owes it to everyone working in racing, to everyone who likes a bet, not to get this wrong. And that means that this story, I think, is the front page this week. Okay, thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and thank you very much, John and Maddy, for your contributions. Just before I go, just a quick plug for our Members Club Ultimate subscription. You can get 50% off your first 3 months if you follow a link in the video description. This is our top tier subscription. It offers you full access to digital newspaper, race replays, and all the exclusives and in-depth journalism by our top reporters. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found today's show interesting and informative, and I hope you'll join us next week.